Welcome to Life Story 999. Today, we have a heart-wrenching story that reveals how a loving father's vigilance exposed a hidden injustice his daughter faced at school. Watch as one moment of curiosity uncovers a deeper issue, leading him to take a stand. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more compelling stories like this one. David and Claire Robinson were overjoyed when their daughter, Lila, was accepted into Sunnybrook Elementary. Nestled in a thriving, diverse neighborhood, the school had a glowing reputation for providing its students with a well-rounded education. David and Claire had dreamed of finding such an environment for their little girl, a place where she could flourish both academically and socially. The couple worked hard, made sacrifices, and even took on a larger mortgage to move into the area and provide Lila with what they believed was the best start in life. Lila, with her bright smile and insatiable curiosity, seemed to be thriving at Sunnybrook. Every day she would come home brimming with stories about her new friends, interesting school projects, and exciting discoveries. Her natural love for learning seemed only to grow in the stimulating environment of her new school. For David and Claire, seeing their daughter so happy was all they had ever wanted. But then one day, things began to change. The first sign was small, a certain quietness that seemed to settle over Lila when she got home from school. At first, David and Claire chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, the school year was well underway, and perhaps their daughter was just tired from the workload. But as the days turned into weeks, they noticed more troubling changes. Lila, who had always been full of stories and laughter, now seemed reluctant to talk about her day. Mealtimes, once filled with chatter, had become increasingly silent. Claire caught Lila staring off into space at times, her expression pensive and withdrawn. David's concern grew. He had always been protective of his daughter, and seeing her spirit dim like this filled him with unease. Claire tried to reassure him. Kids go through phases, she reasoned, and maybe Lila was just dealing with the pressures of school. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He remembered how excited Lila had been when she first started at Sunnybrook. The shift in her demeanor was too stark to ignore. One evening, as Lila quietly picked at her dinner, David made up his mind. He needed to know what was happening at school. He decided he would take the day off work and observe Lila's school environment for himself. He wouldn't make a fuss or draw attention. He just wanted to be there, to see what his daughter was experiencing day after day. The next morning, David dropped Lila off at school as usual, but instead of heading to work, he parked his car a short distance away and waited. He watched as the children poured into the schoolyard, Lila among them. She waved to him before disappearing through the doors, her small figure seeming almost lost among the crowd of students. David's heart tightened. He hoped that whatever was bothering Lila was something minor, something they could easily fix. But deep down, he feared there was more to the story. Something lurking beneath the surface, something that was changing his little girl in ways he didn't yet understand. During the annual parent-teacher conference at Sunnybrook Elementary, David and Claire Robinson walked through the bright hallways adorned with children's artwork, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. They were eager to hear about their daughter Lila's progress from her teachers. As they entered the classroom, they were warmly greeted by Ms. Cooper, Lila's current teacher, and Ms. Green, her new teacher for the upcoming term. The two teachers smiled, inviting them to take a seat at the small desk. Ms. Cooper began by praising Lila's academic performance. "Lila is such a joy to have in class," she said, her eyes lighting up as she spoke. "Her enthusiasm for learning is infectious, and she has an amazing ability to understand complex topics. She is always the first to volunteer during discussions and consistently performs well in all her assignments." Claire couldn't help but beam with pride, while David nodded, feeling a swell of joy at the thought of his daughter excelling in school. But it wasn't just Lila's academic achievements that Ms. Cooper highlighted. "What truly sets Lila apart," Ms. Cooper continued, "is her leadership and empathy. She goes out of her way to help her classmates, especially those who might be struggling. She even organized a study group to help some of her peers with their math. She's not just a top student. She's also a role model, David and Claire exchanged a proud glance. They had always tried to instill kindness and empathy in Lila, and hearing that she was making a difference in her class made all their sacrifices feel worthwhile. As Miss Cooper spoke, David noticed that Miss Green was quiet, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. When it was her turn to speak, Miss Green's tone was polite but noticeably distant. "Yes, Lila is a bright student," she said, her voice lacking the warmth of Miss Cooper's. "I'm looking forward to having her in my class next term." There was something about her demeanor that seemed off to David, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. She avoided eye contact and kept her comments brief, almost as if she was holding something back. David's instincts kicked in. He had learned to trust his gut, and right now, it was telling him that something was not quite right. Claire, on the other hand, seemed content, smiling and thanking both teachers for their dedication. She was always the optimist, preferring to see the best in people, and perhaps it was why she didn't notice the subtle tension in Miss Green's demeanor. As they wrapped up the meeting, Miss Cooper once again expressed how much she would miss having Lila in her class, and Miss Green gave a brief nod, wishing them a good day. David thanked both teachers, but as they left the classroom, a nagging feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't shake the sense that Miss Green's reserved behavior meant something more than just a shy personality. He decided not to dwell on it for now, but a seed of concern had already been planted. Walking back to their car, Claire chatted happily about Lila's achievements, but David found himself distracted. He couldn't ignore the unease that lingered after the meeting. He hoped he was wrong, that his worries were just a result of being an overprotective father. But deep down, he feared that there was something about Miss Green that could explain the recent changes in Lila's behavior, something he needed to keep an eye on. David drove Lila to school that morning, his heart heavy with concern. After dropping her off, he parked his car a short distance away, settling in for what he knew would be a long day. He wanted answers, and if observing his daughter during her school day would give him some insight, he was willing to wait. From his vantage point, he could see the schoolyard, the cafeteria entrance, and even parts of the playground. He watched as Lila joined her classmates, her small figure blending in with the rest of the children. She smiled and waved at her friends, but there was something about her smile, a forced quality that David couldn't ignore. The morning seemed to pass slowly, and David remained vigilant, watching the comings and goings of the students. When lunchtime finally arrived, he saw Lila and her classmates lining up outside the cafeteria. David squinted, trying to catch every detail. He could see her entering the large hall, her eyes scanning the room before she made her way to the lunch line. There was a stiffness in her posture, something that David hadn't seen before. She was usually so carefree, her shoulders relaxed, her demeanor open. Today, however, she looked almost guarded. David watched as Ms. Green, her new teacher, entered the cafeteria as well. She walked directly to the serving line, her presence seeming out of place among the cafeteria staff. David's eyes followed her every move, the tension building in his chest. When it was Lila's turn to receive her lunch, Ms. Green stepped forward, taking over from the cafeteria worker. David could see her speaking to Lila, her expression unreadable. Lila nodded, her gaze fixed downward as Ms. Green placed something on her tray. From where he was parked, David couldn't see exactly what it was, but he could tell from Lila's reaction that it wasn't something she wanted. His stomach churned as he watched Lila walk to an empty table at the far end of the cafeteria, her tray in her hands. She sat down, glancing around before looking down at the tray with an expression that David could only describe as resigned. She picked at the food, her movements slow and hesitant. David felt a rush of emotions, anger, confusion, and most of all, helplessness. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that whatever Ms. Green had done was affecting his daughter deeply. David's heart ached as he watched Lila, alone at her table. The lively, bubbly little girl he knew seemed so distant now, replaced by someone who looked unsure and uncomfortable. He could see other children laughing, eating, and chatting in groups, while Lila sat by herself, her eyes cast downward. Something was very wrong, and David knew he couldn't stay silent. He had to protect his daughter, no matter what it took. He clenched the steering wheel, his resolve hardening. He would get to the bottom of this, and he would make sure Lila was safe. David's concern only grew as the day went on. He could not get the image of Lila sitting alone at that table out of his mind. He had always known her as an outgoing, joyful child, but today she seemed almost defeated. The sight of her picking at that unusual meal, placed on her tray by Ms. Green, left him with an unsettling feeling he couldn't shake. It gnawed at him through the rest of the day, making it impossible for him to focus on anything else. When the school day finally ended, David was there, waiting for Lila as she walked out of the school building. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of whatever she had experienced during the day had shrunk her usually vibrant spirit. David knelt down as she approached, forcing a smile. "Hey, sweetheart. How was school today?" he asked, his voice as gentle as he could manage. Lila hesitated for a moment, her eyes avoiding his. "It was okay," she mumbled, her tone lacking its usual brightness. David took her hand, and they walked together to the car, the silence between them heavy and uncomfortable. Once they were on their way home, David glanced at Lila in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her backpack. David decided he couldn't wait any longer. He had to know what was happening. "Lila, sweetheart," he began cautiously, "I noticed you seemed a bit down today. Is everything okay at school?" For a moment, it seemed as though Lila wouldn't answer. She kept her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, her lips pressed tightly together. David's heart ached at the sight of his daughter looking so lost. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It's just Ms. Green," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. David's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "What about Ms. Green, honey?" Lila hesitated, then took a deep breath, her small frame trembling. "Today at lunch, she said that I should eat what she gave me because it's what people like me should eat," Lila finally confessed, her voice breaking. She looked at her father, her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "I don't understand, Daddy. Why would she say that?" David felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. A mix of anger, guilt, and heartbreak surged through him. Anger at Ms. Green for doing this to his innocent little girl. Guilt for not realizing sooner that something was wrong, and heartbreak at seeing Lila so hurt and confused. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, turning in his seat to face her. "Lila, listen to me," he said, his voice shaking. "What Ms. Green said to you was wrong. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't true. You are perfect just the way you are, and no one has the right to make you feel otherwise." Lila's tears spilled over, and David reached back, taking her small hand in his. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry that you had to go through that," he whispered. Lila nodded, her face crumpling as she tried to hold back sobs. David's heart broke a little more with each tear that rolled down her cheeks. He wanted nothing more than to take away her pain, to make her feel safe again. As they sat there, parked on the side of the road, David made a silent promise to himself and to Lila. He would not let this slide. He would not let anyone hurt his daughter without consequences. He would confront Ms. Green, the school, whoever he needed to ensure that Lila never had to face something like this again. No child should feel like they don't belong, especially not his daughter. When they finally arrived home, Claire was waiting for them at the door. One look at Lila's tear-streaked face, and her expression shifted from welcoming to concerned. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes darting between David and Lila. David gently lifted Lila out of her car seat, pulling her into his arms. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely masking the fury he felt inside. Claire nodded, her eyes widening slightly as she stepped aside to let them in. David carried Lila inside, her small body still trembling against his chest. He set her down on the couch and knelt in front of her. "Lila, sweetheart, why don't you show Mommy your new drawing while Daddy and I talk?" Claire suggested softly, trying to give Lila a moment to breathe. David watched as Claire sat beside their daughter, her arms wrapping around Lila protectively. He knew they had a long road ahead of them. There would be meetings with the school, difficult conversations, and a fight to protect their daughter from people like Ms. Green. But as he looked at Lila, her eyes still red from crying, he knew he would do whatever it took. For Lila, he would fight the world if he had to. David was furious, but he knew he needed to stay composed. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get in the way of doing what was right for Lila. The next morning, after dropping her off at school, David headed straight to the administrative office. He asked to see the principal, Mr. Thompson, and insisted it was urgent. There was no way he could let this go on without taking action. Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man with a kind face, greeted David warmly, though his expression grew serious as David explained the reason for his visit. David recounted what Lila had told him about Ms. Green's behavior, his voice steady but laced with restrained anger. The principal listened intently, nodding as David spoke, his brow furrowing in concern. When David was finished, Mr. Thompson sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'm very sorry to hear this, Mr. Robinson," he said sincerely. "This is a serious allegation, and we will address it immediately." David wasn't satisfied with vague reassurances. "I want a meeting with Ms. Green," he stated firmly. "I need to hear her explanation for this in person." Mr. Thompson hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course. I'll arrange for Ms. Green to join us shortly. Please wait here." David sat in the office, his hands clenched in the fists in his lap. He knew he had to keep his composure, but the thought of someone treating his daughter this way made his blood boil. He would not allow Lila to be made to feel inferior by anyone, especially not someone who was supposed to be nurturing her growth. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Ms. Green walked in, her expression one of polite confusion. Mr. Thompson gestured for her to sit down, and she complied, her eyes darting between David and the principal. "Ms. Green," Mr. Thompson began, "Mr. Robinson has brought a very serious concern to my attention regarding your behavior toward his daughter, Lila, yesterday. He says you made a comment to her that was deeply inappropriate." Ms. Green's face shifted, her eyebrows raising slightly in surprise. She turned to David, her voice calm. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "I would never intentionally say anything to upset Lila. Perhaps my words were taken out of context." David felt his jaw tighten. "My daughter was in tears, Ms. Green," he said, his voice low. "She's not the type to misunderstand something like this. She said you told her to eat what you gave her because it's what people like her should eat. That's not something that can be taken out of context." Ms. Green's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something defensive. "I assure you, Mr. Robinson, I meant no harm," she replied, her tone measured. "Sometimes children misinterpret things, especially when emotions are high." David could feel his patience wearing thin. "I don't think you understand how serious this is," he said, turning to Mr. Thompson. "I want a formal investigation. I want this documented, and I want steps taken to ensure that nothing like this happens again, to my daughter or any other child." Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression grave. "You have my word, Mr. Robinson. We will conduct a thorough investigation, and appropriate action will be taken." David stood, feeling a mix of anger and determination. "I'll be following up on this," he said, his eyes locking with Ms. Green's. "This isn't over." He turned and left the office, his heart pounding. He had taken the first step, but he knew this was just the beginning. He would do whatever it took to protect Lila. David couldn't shake the feeling that this incident went beyond what he had witnessed. He was determined to protect his daughter, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he needed to escalate the matter. That evening, after discussing the situation with Claire, they both agreed it was time to involve the authorities. David called the local police department, explaining the situation in detail and requesting an officer to come to the school the next day to investigate. The following morning, David dropped Lila off at school and then waited in the parking lot, his nerves frayed but his resolve unwavering. Shortly after, Two police officers arrived. Officer Ramirez, a young Latina woman with a reassuring demeanor, and Officer Hughes, a tall, stern-looking man. David greeted them and led them inside to speak with Principal Thompson, who appeared visibly uneasy at the sight of the uniformed officers. Mr. Robinson has brought a serious concern to our attention regarding the treatment of his daughter, David began, his voice steady though his anger simmered beneath the surface. Principal Thompson nodded gravely, and he gestured for the officers to follow him to the cafeteria. They moved in silence, each footstep echoing through the empty hallway, as if the gravity of the situation was weighing down on everyone present. Once inside the cafeteria, David pointed to the table where Lila had been sitting the previous day. The officers moved to the serving line, examining the leftover trays still waiting to be cleared. David watched as Officer Ramirez carefully inspected the contents of Lila's tray, now cold, but unmistakably peculiar. A small, grayish, rubbery piece of meat sat uneaten in the middle of the tray, its unsettling appearance enough to make anyone think twice before eating it. She shot a glance over at Officer Hughes, who shook his head slowly, his expression darkening. "We'll need to document this," Officer Hughes said, pulling out his phone to take pictures of the tray and its contents. Officer Ramirez nodded and spoke quietly. "We'll also need to take statements from the staff." She looked at Principal Thompson, who was now standing off to the side, his face pale. "Principal Thompson, can you please arrange for Ms. Green to meet with us?" she asked, her voice carrying authority. Principal Thompson hesitated, but he eventually nodded. "Of course. I'll bring her in immediately," he said, his tone subdued. David watched him leave, feeling both anxious and vindicated. He knew something had been terribly wrong, and seeing the officers take it seriously gave him some measure of relief. As they waited for Ms. Green, Officer Hughes approached David. "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Robinson," he said, his voice low. "This doesn't look like a simple misunderstanding. We'll need to investigate further. Not only this incident, but any previous complaints involving Ms. Green." David nodded, his jaw set in determination. He would do whatever it took to get to the bottom of this. When Ms. Green finally arrived, her face showed a mixture of annoyance and apprehension. She glanced at the officers and then at David, her posture stiffening. Officer Ramirez stepped forward. "Ms. Green, we need to discuss your actions regarding one of your students, Lila Robinson," she said. "We're also going to need a full statement from you, and we may need to speak to other staff members who are present." Ms. Green opened her mouth to protest, but Officer Hughes cut her off, his tone firm. "This is a serious matter, ma'am. We advise you to cooperate fully." Ms. Green closed her mouth, her expression hardening. David watched, his emotions a mixture of rage and sorrow. His daughter's well-being had been compromised, and now the truth would finally be brought to light. The officers documented everything, taking notes, photographs, and preparing to question the cafeteria staff. David knew this was only the beginning of a longer process, but seeing the wheels of justice begin to turn gave him a sense of hope. He would not rest until he was sure that Lila and every other child was safe from harm. No matter what it took, he was ready to fight for his daughter's future. Back at home, the atmosphere was heavy with emotion as Lila sat on the couch, her eyes red from crying. Claire knelt beside her, gently rubbing her back, while David sat across from them, his heart aching for his little girl. He felt a deep sense of guilt. Guilt for not realizing sooner that something was wrong, and guilt for not protecting her from the hurt she had endured. But amid the guilt, there was also a fierce determination. He would make sure she never had to go through anything like this again. "Lila, sweetheart," Claire said softly, her voice filled with warmth, "you are so brave, and we are so proud of you. What happened today wasn't your fault. It was wrong, and we're going to make sure that no one ever treats you like that again." Lila looked up at her mother, her lip trembling. "But why would she do that, Mommy?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What did I do wrong?" David felt his heart break all over again at the sound of his daughter's pain. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting Lila's. "You didn't do anything wrong, Lila. Sometimes people say and do mean things because they don't understand or because they're just not good people. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault. You are smart, kind, and amazing just the way you are. Lila sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Claire pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as if to shield her from all the bad in the world. After a few moments, David joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them. They sat there in silence, a family united in their love for each other. Eventually, Claire spoke again, her voice steady. We want you to know that it's okay to speak up when something doesn't feel right. You should never be afraid to tell us or ask for help. We will always be here for you, no matter what. Lila nodded slowly, her small body relaxing a little in her mother's embrace. David took a deep breath, his voice calm but resolute. We're going to make sure this never happens again. We're going to fight for you and for every kid who deserves to feel safe and happy at school. And we'll always be here to support you, Lila, through everything. Lila looked at her parents, her eyes still glistening with tears, but there was a spark of hope there too. For the first time in days, David saw a glimpse of the bright, brave little girl he knew. They would face whatever came next together as a family. Following a thorough investigation, Ms. Green was dismissed from her position at Sunnybrook Elementary. The findings were clear. Her behavior had been inappropriate, discriminatory, and completely against the values the school stood for. The administration took swift action, ensuring that such an incident would never be repeated. New policies were implemented, including mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff, stricter oversight, and the establishment of an anonymous reporting system for students and parents. David and Claire felt an overwhelming sense of relief when they received the news. It wasn't just about Ms. Green being held accountable. It was about making sure that Lila and every other child would be safe and supported moving forward. As they sat together in the principal's office, listening to Mr. Thompson outline the changes being put in place, David could feel the weight on his chest begin to lift. For the first time in what felt like weeks, he could breathe a little easier, knowing that their voices had made a difference. The relief on Lila's face when they told her the news was palpable. She listened as her parents explained that Ms. Green would no longer be teaching at her school and that new rules were being put in place to protect all the students. Lila's eyes brightened, and for the first time in days, she smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was a moment of hope, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there could be change. David and Claire knew this wasn't the end of their journey. They would continue to support Lila, helping her rebuild her confidence and feel safe again. But they were thankful that their voices had been heard, that they had stood up for their daughter, and that it had led to real, tangible change. They hoped that the new policies would protect other children from going through what Lila had endured, creating a safer environment for everyone. As they walked out of the school that day, David looked at Claire and Lila, his heart swelling with pride. They had faced a challenge that had tested their family, but they had come out stronger. Together, they had taken a stand, and together, they had made a difference. It was a lesson they would carry with them, a reminder of the power of speaking up, of resilience, and of the unbreakable bond of family. Following a thorough investigation, Ms. Green was dismissed from her position at Sunnybrook Elementary. The findings were clear. Her behavior had been inappropriate, discriminatory, and completely against the values the school stood for. The administration took swift action, ensuring that such an incident would never be repeated. New policies were implemented, including mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff, stricter oversight, and the establishment of an anonymous reporting system for students and parents. David and Claire felt an overwhelming sense of relief when they received the news. It wasn't just about Ms. Green being held accountable. It was about making sure that Lila and every other child would be safe and supported moving forward. As they sat together in the principal's office, listening to Mr. Thompson outline the changes being put in place, David could feel the weight on his chest begin to lift. For the first time in what felt like weeks, he could breathe a little easier, knowing that their voices had made a difference. The relief on Lila's face when they told her the news was palpable. She listened as her parents explained that Ms. Green would no longer be teaching at her school and that new rules were being put in place to protect all the students. Lila's eyes brightened, and for the first time in days, she smiled. A genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was a moment of hope, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there could be change. David and Claire knew this wasn't the end of their journey. They would continue to support Lila, helping her rebuild her confidence and feel safe again. But they were thankful that their voices had been heard, that they had stood up for their daughter, and that it had led to real, tangible change. They hoped that the new policies would protect other children from going through what Lila had endured, creating a safer environment for everyone. As they walked out of the school that day, David looked at Claire and Lila, his heart swelling with pride. They had faced a challenge that had tested their family, but they had come out stronger. Together, they had taken a stand, and together, they had made a difference. It was a lesson they would carry with them, a reminder of the power of speaking up, of resilience, and of the unbreakable bond of family.